Welcome to the Explorer Poet Podcast, an exploration of the blurry line separating our physical world from our abstract realities. Conversations and stories, myths and reality, science and the gods we worship, the esoteric and the everyday. Come explore with me. J.L.M. Morton, welcome to the Explorer Poet Podcast.
Thanks very much for having me on.
Yeah,
it's good
absolutely.
To see you.
Yeah, you too. It's always fun for me to speak to somebody across the pond, I would say, because you guys, your accent's so much fun, but also you have a different way of, like a different dialect. It's so much more proper. And as a writer myself, I really enjoy the way, you use words and phrases that are very different from the words and phrases that I use over here. It feels so much closer to the source.
Interesting. Yeah. And then there's sort of like a lexicon that you sort of pick up. I find I've got words in my vocabulary that I've picked up from different places around the world that I've visited or worked in. And I often say them in the accent from that place. So that's a kind of another sort of interesting thing I think about the language that we use. And I'm interested you say that you like speaking to people from across the pond. I was doing a list the other day of poets that most inspire me, and actually a lot of them are American. Interestingly, I think there's kind of like quite a distinction between like English and American poetry. Not to get into it too quickly, but
let's do it.
There's a looseness there. There's a sort of a permission, if you like, to be vulnerable that we don't necessarily have in the British poetic tradition in the same way. And I'm kind of interested. I'm interested by that myself. Yeah.
Do you have some examples? Do you have some examples of poets that you mean?
I guess I'm thinking about poets like Dennis Smith, Jericho Brown, my mind's gone blank now, of course. Caroline Forche, although not fully American. I'm trying to think. Sorry, my mind's gone blank, Josh.
Oh, that's okay. I actually, what you're saying makes sense to me, because when I listen to somebody from, say, England, or I have friends in New Zealand, and I love talking to them, the language is, in America, we seem to shorten things. We seem to like try to get to the point really quickly, but there's almost like a proper way of speaking that it includes more words, it includes things that we cut out. And so maybe that's partly what you're talking about in the American way of speaking more vulnerably or more openly, is that it has like a less proper, or what's the word? It's like less formalized.
Yeah.
In a way.
And there's a directness there that perhaps we don't have. There's a directness, but also Americans are deeply polite. I mean, that's another thing that I find interesting. That there's a sort of respect and a politeness there at the same time, but there is that kind of directness.
Yeah. Well, I jumped right into this, but why I enjoy speaking with writers in general is because they're thinkers. But also, if I was to speak to somebody who writes who writes fiction, or in your case poetry, I find that not only are they thinkers, but they're also feelers. Because I don't think you can get through poetry. I don't think you can actually produce, something that moves people unless you yourself are a feeler. And I find it interesting. I find it, that's one of the reasons why I do these podcasts, is just because in my day-to-day life, I don't always find people who have thought through things, but it's also fun to find somebody who thinks and feels at the same time.
There's a really lovely quote that I think about quite a lot by a poet called Caroline Bird, who's a British poet who I love a lot. And she says, "The image is the emotion." And I think I've even got it on a Post-it note above my desk somewhere. And I think that's so true in poetry, that if you can make an image stand for an emotion in that way, and to sort of hold the weight of feeling, it can be so much more effective than essentially kind of telling that emotion in a kind of a more direct way. And there's a universality, but also like a layeredness to imagery that can be, interpreted in different ways depending on the audience, depending on the reader. And I think that's like one of the kind of deep wells of poetry's power.
Yeah, absolutely. Robert Frost has a similar quote where he says, the feeling finds the thought and the thought finds the words.
Right.
And I think it's a beautiful way to approach it.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I originally came across your work or found out about you through the London Arts-Based Research Center, and they
Mm-hmm.
do they do the Indelible Evening series, and I think you were presenting on something related to World Environment Day, if I'm
Oh,
not mistaken.
yes. Yes.
Yeah. So it seems like your interests cover a broad range of things. Obviously, writing, poetry. You said that you're working on a nonfiction presently as well.
Yeah.
Um, but obviously, it also encapsulates, the world around you, the environment, the people, nature. So I'm really curious. I guess I'm curious just to start with where your story begins as far as wanting to put things into words, where your source of inspiration comes from, or your motivation to I don't know, produce in such a way.
Yeah. I mean, it's a really interesting question is what, where does it start? And it starts in different places at different times simultaneously, if that makes sense. I thought for a long time, so I've always written since I was a kid, since I was little, and wanted to be a writer since I was really quite young, actually. And when my grandparents passed away, they'd kept a visitor's book, and I went through that visitor's book when we were kind of clearing the house and saw there was all these poems in there that I'd written over the years. Um, every time I stayed there, I seemed to dedicate a poem in the in this visitor's book, which I'd completely forgotten about. I was totally unaware of. But I do remember at school having a kind of, I don't know if you have these in the States, having like a careers interview when my careers tutor said, he was an English teacher actually. When I said I wanted to be a writer, he said, "Don't be so ridiculous. You need to do something that's more practical and pragmatic, and that's more likely to sort of earn money." And I think they run some kind of test on me, and I came out as somebody who perhaps ought to go for a career as a prison officer, which I just thought was so far off the mark. It was hilarious. Anyway, I kind of took that quite a knock, I took that as quite a knock, but I did go off to university and I did study English. And I did want to become an academic. That was kind of going to be my route in, really. And I had this sort of vision of my future of kind of having the tweed suit and the cottage and the roses over the door and the dog at my feet and reading books and talking about books. And, I love stories and I loved my whole university. And I stayed on and I did postgrad. And did a PhD about whiteness and women's writing in the Anglophone Caribbean, looking at how like our social identities are constructed and how one of the ways they're constructed is through words and through literature. So yeah, my interests have been very rooted in landscape and place and history. And I went off and I taught for a little while, a very short time actually in university after I'd finished my doctorate, and realized really quickly that I just actually needed to get out of the academy, as it were, and get out into the world. I'd gone kind of continuously through for about 7 years in university. And I got diverted into a career in international development, kind of completely by accident, but in a way, when I look back, I think not totally by accident, because I was always really interested in social justice, as you might be able to tell from the subject of my PhD, and kind of really interested in different literatures from different countries, in different voices from different cultures, and sort of exploring that and exploring how not only utilitarian way that literature can be a tool, but I am interested in how literature can form us as people and shape our ways of being in the world. And so I got sort of diverted into this career, and I went to live in the Niger Delta and in China, and I lived in Rwanda, and I ended up going to quite a lot of contexts that were kind of immediately post-conflict or very fragile, and often working on girls' education, working with women's groups, working on supporting like children with disabilities to get them into school. And I did it very grassroots to begin with, and then over time I began to work more at a systems level, began to work with governments and so on and so on. But anyway, during the course of that time, I wrote a lot. I wrote a lot of letters home. And it was sort of as a result of doing that, really, that I got persuaded by a few people that I really ought to take up writing a little bit more seriously. And I do remember I'd finished a contract. I don't know if you've ever heard of Red Nose Day. It's like a day of, it's been going since the 1980s in the UK. And it's a day and a night on British TV of comedy. So all the kind of best comics in the country come together. They wear this iconic red clown's nose, which they sell in all the shops to raise money for charities overseas and in the UK. And it has been really successful over the years, come in for lots of criticism and for lots of very good reasons, which I won't go into now. But anyway, I was working for them. I'd finished working for them as a kind of education advisor, and I was about to go off to my next job. And I was on a holiday break in between the two jobs, and I was doing a yoga retreat in Dahab in Egypt. And I, unbeknownst to me, was doing it with this woman who was married to Shane McGowan, the lead singer of the Pogues. And she was quite out there, but brilliant, really bright and fascinating. And we went out to the desert one night to drink tea and look at the stars. And she kind of grabbed me by the hands and said, you really need, your destiny is to be a writer. You really need to write. And something about that whole experience, just feeling validated, like I had things to say, like what I had to say was of interest to others, was enough to make me pick up the phone from that holiday and phone my next employer and say, I'm really sorry, I'm not going to come back. I'm not going to go and do the job. So that's what I did. And I signed up to do a MA at Goldsmiths in London part-time, not long after I got back. And I kind of started to take writing really seriously. Started freelancing in my international development job, just very part-time. And that's kind of when I started taking it really seriously. And that was probably about 15 years ago now, something like that. And I did the MA, and I thought for a really long time, I thought I was a fiction writer and was trying to write a novel. And it was sort of going on okay. I was constantly reading poetry all the time and loved it, and would make my annual pilgrimage to the T.S. Eliot Prize in London on the South Bank every January. And, I absolutely adored it, but never, ever considered myself a poet. And on the night of the prize giving of the master's degree, when we'd finished and I was up for this prize, I found out that day that I was pregnant with my first child, which was wonderful and sort of planned, but yet unexpected. And it sort of derailed me for a little while. And I kind of was trying to write a novel or long form fiction while I had a baby. And then I had another one in quite quick succession. And I was quite frustrated because obviously I wanted to honor this time with my babies, which I knew was going to slip away so quickly. And I also still had this real compulsion to write, because I think for anybody who is an artist or creates in any way, there is a compulsion to it. I've recently started to call it a bit of an obsession, actually. I do think there has to be a kind of obsessive element in your nature to make you want to pursue something to a kind of state of excellence, or a state that you're kind of content with the finished sort of product or whatever it is you're going to share. So I got sort of so frustrated with that, of never being able to catch up with myself, never really being able to make any progress, that I swore off writing at one point. And I had an agent then, and I kind of got rid of my agent. I kind of said, I can't do this anymore. I threw my novel in the bin, and I was just like, right, that is it. I'm never writing it ever again. And it was a really odd time, and I didn't write for a couple of months, maybe 3 months, maybe more. And then kind of unbidden, the poetry just started coming. And it was almost like a tap had just been turned on. It was like, oh, actually, this is what I'm supposed to be doing, right? And as a mother to two young kids, it was like, I could write a poem while the kettle boiled, or I was stirring the pasta. It was the kind of creativity that could fit into the cracks of my life as a mother, and I would be able to go out for a walk with a baby on my front and be thinking about a poem, and I'd be able to record a note on my phone or write myself a quick text note. And I was kind of, yeah, so I sort of pursued that, and it kind of developed from there really, and then became more and more as the kids grew older. Then they haven't grown up yet. They're still only 10 and 12. But it's kind of become a more and more serious part of my life. And certainly in the last, um, well, probably year and a bit, it's become really central since I published my debut collection, Red Handed, last May 2024. Um, yeah, and it's just it's very much a part of who I am, you know. I know that it's what I'm supposed to be doing. I don't really believe in destiny or fate or anything like that per se. I'm not a religious person, but I do feel like I'm right where I need to be, and it's a good feeling. It's totally precarious. It's sort of financially, you know, insane, you know, in many ways. But the sort of the satisfaction that you get from doing it, and the joy and pleasure and enrichment you get from collaborating with others and talking to others who are like-minded is a real gift that I kind of never could have imagined the value of really before I started doing it. So yeah, that's a very long-winded answer to your question of kind of where it came from. And it comes from different places. Like once you start, you know, writing regularly and it's sort of part of your daily practice, or, you know, you're kind of getting, you know, things from all over the place that you want to write about and themes you want to focus on. And I do tend now to try to write thematically as a way of kind of making things that are kind of can come into a book, you know, that I can envisage as something that is kind of, yeah, a longer piece of work, that can be quite immersive, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. There's so much there that I relate to, and I agree that it's one of the reasons again why I ask people like you to come on here and have a conversation with me, is because when you can find people who think in a similar way about life, about creativity, about that obsession, it's
Yeah.
really refreshing, right? It's really refreshing to have people who can just connect on that level. And yeah, thanks for sharing all that. Like, there's a lot of that that's beautiful to me, from even as a child being able to see, oh, this is something that's fascinating to me. This is something that I want to do. And it's probably, I would imagine that you were probably a big reader as well as a kid.
Mhm. Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, particularly from my teenage years, I talk to my own children about this quite a lot. I've got one child that's really quite an avid reader and will, of her own accord, pick up books and magazines. And I've got another child who used to be an avid reader and is going through a phase at the moment of not being interested in reading at all. And I think about this a lot and think about when I was around about her age. So she's now 12, she's just turned 12. I was probably quite similar. And I remember my mum sort of forcing books on me all the time that were really kind of age inappropriate, but she loved them, like Little Women. And they were kind of these huge tomes with tiny writing that, you know, with very close lines spacing, you know, on the page, and really tricky to read. And it wasn't really until I was mid-teens, I think, that I really got into reading a lot more. And it was actually triggered by reading a book by an author called Laurie Lee, who comes from the place where I now live, Stroud in Gloucestershire. And he wrote this book called Cider with Rosie. I don't know if you know it. It's kind of like a real staple of like the English canon, I guess, in a way. But what was important about it to me, it's very sort of, it is a memoir kind of post World War, like World War One, post World War One, rural life in Gloucestershire, in this county where I live, and some of it's quite sort of rose tinted. Some of the prose is quite purple, you know, it's quite florid. But what was really important to me at the time was reading something that was from where I was from, and I thought, oh, okay, it's possible for us to, like, our place is important enough to put into a book, you know. And it was that really that I was just really fascinated by, and I sort of recognized elements, even though it had been written for an era that way sort of preceded the era that I was reading it in. I recognized a lot of the countryside still in that book, countryside that I kind of lived in and played in, and so on. And that was a kind of, that really sort of set me off then, of kind of feeling like I had a place in literature in a way, or had a place in stories. Let's not say literature, because that's way more highfalutin than I would have thought of it at that point in my life. Yeah. And then I think subsequently just brilliant teachers, you know, as you may have found too, just brilliant teachers who could make complex texts like the metaphysical poets, like John Donne and so on, totally digestible and relatable and exciting and sexy and weird and, incredibly complex and creative and imaginative. And yeah, and just some brilliant novels. And actually, that was the point at which I started getting really into American literature. And I sort of tried to ensure that that would be part of my education going forward, as I moved through to university, and so on. But yeah, reading. And now I'm an absolutely avid reader. My TBR pile is, it's never ending, right? And it's, yeah. But yeah. I love reading, and I love the calmness that brings to you, and the kind of the centeredness, just sitting quietly with a book, not a screen. I don't have a Kindle. I actually read paper. Yeah, I love the sense that it gives you.
Yeah, and as a writer, probably reading. So I also write, and I've only been doing it for about 4 or 5 years now. But I am pursuing like those long form fiction novel versions of writing.
Right.
And I find that reading is so important from the perspective of, one, just constantly filling yourself up with good writing and good ideas,
Yeah.
and storytelling, and seeing how people explain things, and how they develop characters, and there's all of that. But also the other thing that I really get from writing from reading, and I read both nonfiction and fiction. I try to kind of intermingle the two. And what I discover all the time is that I'll write something and not really sure where it comes from. It just kind of, how like when you're writing, like you say, it just kind of, you open the faucet and it kind of flows out. I think of it as these like unconscious bubbles that just arise to the surface. And then I just try to have the courage to not fight them, but just let them come out. But then as I'm reading, I also discover that I start to make sense of the things that I've already written. And I start to say like, oh, that's what that symbology meant, even though I didn't know why I had put it in at the time. And I find that really valuable.
Do you find that you write in order to work out what you think about
absolutely.
certain things?
Yeah. I write. So I was very similar as a child. I felt like I had to write. Like I felt like that's why I was here. Again, similar to you, like I don't think of it in like necessarily a metaphysical way, but it was just inherent to me that if I could do anything that was meaningful in this life, it would probably be writing. And so I always wanted to do it. It took me a really long time to get to a point where I felt like I had enough life experience and enough, I don't know, that I had figured enough out about myself that all of a sudden I was like, oh, I have a lot of stories to write. I just hadn't realized it before. And and now as I write, I just find that it's a process of like thinking, but it's also a process of working through things that I was never capable of working through before. So I actually have this idea around creativity where there's, and I don't mean to make it binary, but there's like unconscious creativity and conscious creativity. And I think that what I mean by that is that people will write stories, they'll create pieces of art, they'll make movies, whatever it may be. And for some people, they're not exactly sure. They might not be fully conscious of the psychological significance of what they're creating. But I guess I read enough into depth psychology and enough, into symbolism and dreams and storytelling that I began to see, in a similar way that you speak about it, I began to see that stories are actually the things that create us. They're the things that give us whatever identity we have. And so I also see, like, as I write, I'm uncovering things about myself. It might come out as a character that's not me. It might come out as a situation I've never actually experienced. It might come out as symbols or, whatever it may be. But once I get it out and then I sit with it and I work through it in multiple drafts, edit after edit, at some point I feel different inside myself. I feel as if I've integrated something or I've figured something out where, after, honestly, I wrote like a manuscript for a novel, and it was It was way too long, far too long, and it was not. It was fiction, but it was also extremely autobiographical. And so I had to go through a lot of. I used the book as a way to work through a lot of difficult things that I had experienced in my childhood, and I just found that when I was done, I just felt like a different person. I no longer struggled with certain emotions. I no longer struggled with kind of stifling my emotions. A lot of my life, I had gone through
Hmm.
life with kind of a pit in my stomach and an uncertainty about why I was feeling the way I was feeling. But when I had finished several edits of this book, um, I just found that I no longer had that pit in my stomach.
Mm. Mm.
And so I think it only worked that way for me. Well, I can't speak to anybody else, but I think it worked that way for me because I was writing unconsciously. I was allowing it to just come out. I was trying to put my ego aside and just writing whatever came out that day when I wrote. But at the same time, I was able to then go back and look at it in a conscious way and kind of connect the dots between what I'd put on the page and what I'd actually
Mm.
experienced in life. And maybe that's what I mean by consciously writing something. And I think when you do that, it can actually really help in a healing perspective.
Yeah, even if that healing kind of perspective is sort of unintentional and you're not necessarily writing for therapeutic purposes, you're making me think about my experience of writing red-handed. So the sort of first part of the collection looks at kind of the West Country where I live. It's kind of it looks at the textile trade and which it was really famous for and which produced the red cloth that clothed the British armies of empire. And so I kind of use that as a starting point to look at how rural England is, as chocolate box pretty as it can look, it's been deeply entrenched in kind of global kind of networks of power and oppression and violence and so on. So I kind of unraveled a lot of that in the first part of my collection. And then the second part, it was sort of based on kind of an embodied relationship with the land and saying, okay, I've unpacked all of this about this place. Um, what do I do with it now? How do I find belonging in the ruins? Because I've kind of not torn it to shreds as such, but I've exposed something about this place that a lot of people don't want to talk about, and some people still don't want to talk about. And I did have some negative local, not much, but there was some negative local reaction to my book, particularly among older generations who were just like, we don't want to talk about that. We don't want to unravel it. We don't want it. Let's leave it. The past is the past. Let's leave it in the past. But I'm kind of thinking, well, I've got to live here, I've got to find a way to be in this landscape. And so I then wrote quite a lot about how you reconnect with the landscape and you kind of find belonging in the ruins of that you've are of your own making in some ways. And I latched onto these kind of or discovered these figures that were worshipped locally and very particular to our local area, these Romano or well Celtic mother goddesses that were worshipped along the rivers, the waterways of our local rivers, particularly the River Churn and the River Frome and the River Avon. And what was really specific about the Cotswolds is that these mother goddess figures were worshipped. They were always pictured in triplicate. So maybe maiden, mother, crone, past, present, future, some kind of triplicate kind of identity, gesturing to time and the different ages of woman. And they've been interpreted as these kind of guardian type figures. And I kind of became really interested in them as kind of symbolic of a way of re-engaging with the land that is more symbiotic, which is more mutually beneficial, which kind of tries to break down some of the barriers between human and more than human, and kind of have um, a more caring, a kinder relationship with the land. And so, like a lot of the poems in that final part of the book are kind of use the mother goddess figures as a kind of lens, a way into talking about care and custodianship. So I did that. I wrote that, and it was published last year. But it's only really been quite recently that I've realized it was about all of those things. It was about environmental care and eco-poetics and all of that. But actually, what I realized was I was writing about my own mother, and I hadn't really, I mean, it seems so obvious when I say it out loud now. Um, but I didn't realize that at the time at all. And I was writing about my relationship with my mum and my relationship with myself as a mother now. And that is kind of given me a kind of a stability that I perhaps didn't have before. I had quite a lot of postnatal anxiety, and felt that for a long time I was a bad mum. And I struggled with that a lot. I did a lot of really negative self-talk about my role as a mum and whether or not I was good enough, you know. And little did I know I was working it through in that poetry collection. And like I say, it's clear as day now, but at the time I wouldn't have said that was what I was doing at all.
Yeah, I think in order for it to be really good art, really good creativity, then it needs to be unconscious in the moment. I feel like if you
Mm.
become too conscious of it, then your ego is going to step in and try to kind of control or manipulate what you're saying. And then that's really where it just doesn't become as meaningful as it could be.
Well, it's
But
that notion of the ineffable,
yeah,
the kind of almost indescribable, the kind of unquantifiable, the ineffable. That's what kind of makes really good artwork, I think.
yeah, it's like the mystery of the abyss, the unconscious. You don't know. Yeah, if you know perfectly well what you're trying to write, it's gonna. Again, I think I use terms such as the ego and the unconscious, um, but I really do feel like creativity over all of time, those stories that have been evolving forever and crafting us and kind of guiding us, each of us in our own time and place, being the result of those stories. Um, it's always okay. Even for me, when I look back on ancient myths and how those myths have changed all the way up to our present day, and the myths that we inherited from the past and the myths that are working themselves out today, the people who actually move the myth forward are always some kind of suffering creative who just kind of fully immerses themselves in that creative process, lets the truth bubble up, doesn't fight it,
Mm.
and the emotion that those pieces of work are able to elicit in others is the other's unconscious part of themselves recognizing the same struggle that they're having with their time and place. And I think even as large scale societies, as cultures, as groups of people, as we collectively work through the stories in the same way, eventually whatever that story needed to do to us to help us progress to some level or overcome something in the past, eventually it's going to happen. And at that point, the next story, the next version of the story, the next iteration or evolution of the art or the story needs to come out, and it's going to come out in the same way that it did in the past, through the creative person who just fully gives themselves to the work.
Mm. Which is a really good explanation for why people return time and time and time again to Greek myth, for example. And
Yeah.
it just comes, continuous return.
Yeah, in the same way that the Greeks constantly studied the Egyptian myths. And
Uh-huh.
it's just like this process that we've all been going through forever. And I find it
Mm.
fascinating. I think some of that is thinking about the whole story of all humankind and how we started, as people married to our environment, uh, you know, worshiping the mother goddess in our natural state, all the way to where we are now. It's a fascinating
Mm.
story to me. If there was one wish that I could have, it would probably be to just be able to see it from beginning to end, to see
Right.
the whole thing. I think it would be magnificent. But
Mm.
going all the way back to when you were telling your story, you were talking about as a child, you went to this career tutor and you brought up this idea that you want to be a writer, and they dismissed it as not practical or not pragmatic. And I
Mm.
think the majority of society holds that view, where if what you want to do doesn't seem economical, if it doesn't seem like something that will bring value to the economy or to the workforce, they think of it as, oh, this is a person who's never going to contribute. Um, but I think that seeing the story, that whole human story, the greater kind of overlaying story, in a real way, the people who are willing to take the risks as you did, quit your job, walk away from it, and go do that thing that you're called to do, those are the people who bring, the kind of deeper spiritual value to their society. They might not make a lot of money, but they're actually bringing a lot of value to the human species.
Yeah, completely. And I kind of like, I am constantly amazed, and even more so actually as I get older and I'm mature, of this continuous questioning of the value of art. I mean, haven't we answered this question by now? It's like deeply, it's essential to who we are as people. The stories that we tell ourselves about who we are, and the stories we tell one another for comfort, for solace, for joy, for laughter, for life, for the absolute, the vast kind of diversity of human experience. It's absolutely critical. But if you want to get, into the economics of it, the creative industries in the UK alone are worth billions. It's one of our greatest exports, and yet the government still continues to question and kind of divest from arts and culture, which I just find extraordinary. I also find it really interesting, this kind of when it comes to poetry in particular, where people, and I don't know what the culture's like in America around poetry, but even though the British are very proud in lots of ways of their poetic tradition, people don't read poetry. Like, the readership of poetry is really small. And that's one of the reasons why I say poets, for example, don't really make much money from just being a poet, because it's hard to make a living from it. So they do other things, they teach, they whatever. And I find it quite interesting that people will sort of be quite dismissive of poetry, or they'll sort of like take the mickey out of poetry, or they'll just go, ooh, oh, no poetry. However, when someone's born, when someone gets married, when someone dies, prose fails them. And so they bring poetry into ritual and ceremony, and those moments, those kind of intense moments at which we mark the milestones of our lives. And I just find that kind of tension really curious. And I think it's kind of, it's got its roots certainly in education and the way we teach literature and poetry in particular in schools in this country, that people are frightened of it. They think that they can't understand it. I think probably Shakespeare might have something to do with that, trying to teach 13-year-old Shakespeare, and they really struggle with the language and whatever. And so the curriculum and the pedagogy and the way it's actually taught. But I've kind of become so sort of fascinated by that I last year I trained as a celebrant, because I feel that part of the work of being an artist and a creative and a poet is to be in community with that work. So it isn't just about words on a page and creating beautiful work on a page that could be sold in a bookshop. And I love that kind of the kind of the conscious unconscious exchange, the exchange of minds that goes on in that reading process, but actually to be sort of out in the community, using poetry, that kind of heightened language in a kind of ritual context that makes sense for people in a contemporary moment.
Yeah, absolutely. You're gonna have to forgive my American ignorance, but what is a celebrant?
So a celebrant is, you probably have them, I'm sure you do. So it's kind of, a celebrant often plays the role of a priest, but without the religion, essentially.
Yeah.
So they can, in this country, they can perform wedding ceremonies. They can't do the legal aspects of getting married. That has to be done kind of in a government office. You get your certificate, but the celebrant will do the ceremony essentially, or the funeral.
Yeah. We have people who fill similar roles where it's on this, the spiritual side rather than the, I don't know, clerical government side.
Right.
Yeah. Well, I think what you're saying makes a lot of sense. So I have a couple of thoughts. One, just to kind of add on to what you're saying about how people resist the idea of poetry, but then they go through ceremony, whether it's at church, whether it's a wedding, ritual, getting married, the way people say prayers, even in our government agencies, or kind of like in courts and systems of law, in legislature, they all go through ceremonies every time that involve some kind of, poetic
ritual.
Yeah. And then also even, music is essentially just poetry put to some kind of rhythm, a melody or something. And so people are constantly singing poetry, and it makes them feel something. And so this idea that they need to understand what the words mean is is kind of silly when it obviously moves them in an emotional way to where they really connect with it.
Well, how many times have you had a song in your head that you don't actually know the words of, and you
Yeah,
kind of make them up and then
yeah,
discover maybe even years later that the words are wrong?
yeah,
You know?
yeah. Or so I do this thing where I sing the words wrong because that's how I hear them. I'm not
Yes.
trying to sing it wrong, but I'll sing it wrong, and then I'll go and find the actual words to the song, and I go, nah, I think I like my version better. So I just sing it the way I want to sing it. But yeah, I think that there's this interesting resistance to what you might call the humanities, the arts, literature, story, where if, at one point in time, to go to university, to get a higher education was essentially to just study the humanities. You were studying Greek mythology, you were studying literature, you were studying poetry. The intent of it was not to make you, to turn you into a poet. The intent of it was to just turn you into a well-rounded person who understood
Right.
people, who understood yourself, who
Mm.
understood your environment and your culture. And I think over all of time, as humans, we've probably done this thing where we literalize our stories and our myths and our art way too much. We start to see it as these concrete things that should be or that are, rather than representations of where our psyche is at in a given place and time. And in our modern world, we're very fixated on science, logic, reason, empirical data, just being able to
Um,
really turn everything into something tangible.
yeah.
And inherently, as human beings, our experience is intangible. It's this kind of mysterious existence that we have that we can never fully explain, both on the outside and on the inside.
Mm.
And I think that, maybe there's something to the mental health epidemic in the West, um, that's related to this push away from the mystery, the unconscious, the art and the story, and is centered in this need to turn everything into something concrete.
Mhm. Yeah, I completely agree. I'm following I'm finding it quite an interesting research thread at the moment around, and this might seem like a bit of a reach, but bear with me, it isn't, I don't think, about the use of psychedelics in medicine as a way to improve people's well-being. There's a really strong and building evidence-based, like scientific evidence-based to please the government, right? This quantifiable data, this empirical data on the value of psychedelics to treat certain mental health conditions and sort of certain perhaps ongoing, like long-term chronic conditions. And I think that part of what I'm really interested in about the use of psychedelics is the fact that, they've been used in indigenous cultures, for hundreds, if not thousands of years as a way to sort of connect with other aspects of our psyche and our community and the world around us. And I'm kind of really interested in the way in which something like psychedelics can like lower that veil, I guess, between the human and the more than human, the physical and the spiritual, and perhaps reach into some of those some of that unconscious that you're sort of gesturing to. And I'm really interested in how it can be used in a kind of environmental writing, eco-poetic context, to not necessarily to take drugs and write. That's not what I mean. To sort of, take the psychedelics, but to think of it as a kind of as a concept, as an idea itself, about how you can kind of find ways to access that unconscious in sort of different ways, but also in a way that is kind of interestingly offering a new frontier for kind of people's well-being and mental health.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm actually speaking later this week with a guy named Mike Berger, and he does does some research in psychedelics, so it's a poignant
Ah,
topic. Yeah, um,
yeah.
yeah. I think that the modern world, in a lot of ways, we disregard our spiritual side, and so often, at least the way that I see a lot of the mental health issues that people struggle with these days, um, whether it's depression, anxiety, ADHD, bipolar, whatever it may be, it almost seems to me like these are the psyche's way of inviting somebody to take a journey. and
Uh-huh.
not necessarily a psychedelic journey, but a personal journey of self-discovery. It's
Mm.
if you know, from a Joseph Campbell perspective, the hero's journey, this is the call to the adventure, you know? And
Mm-hmm.
not everybody sees it that way. Some people see mental health issues as something wrong with them. And that's how a lot of the modern biomedical industry treats it, where they give somebody a pill to alleviate the symptoms, but the pill never actually solves the underlying issue. It's like wearing
Mm-hmm.
a
Yeah.
bandage.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so, I guess just speaking from my own personal experience with psychedelics, to have a really deep experience with the unconscious, it it kind of finally it can formalize in your mind this idea that, oh, this is something that's supposed to help me move along my path, to help me get better. In the same way that I was talking earlier about writing and coming away from writing feeling like a different person. It's an exploration of the unconscious, what's going on down there that you're not fully aware of, and by bringing those things to light, you can find a lot of healing.
Mm.
And like you were saying, when some of the people in your area were pushing back on the things you were writing, saying, just leave those alone, just leave those alone. Well, the truth is that we all have to live our lives. We all have to experience it. And if we're going to experience it, even if it's a little painful at the time, and psychedelic trips can be very painful,
Yeah.
it's probably best to solve it, to go back and revisit it and figure it out so that the rest of your life that you have to experience is at least enjoyable and worth experiencing.
Mm. Mm. So what I'm wondering, what sort of thing do you write about, Josh? What are your kind of what are your interests in terms of the writing? What you're writing at the moment?
Yeah, I'm actually, so I said I wrote one manuscript, and I really poured a lot of myself into it. But when I came out of it, I thought, you know what, because I've never been published. So my thought was, as a first time author, this probably isn't the book that's going to get me published, given its length and style. Um, not that I think the style is anything but what it was supposed to be. But
Uh-huh.
it's not an easy book to read. But I guess to answer your question, currently I'm writing another story, and I think what I've discovered is that what I want to write is my own myths. In a way, I never got into writing as anything therapeutic, but I discovered that that's what it could be. And so in a way, I feel like I just have all of these ideas swirling around inside of me, and they need a way to come out. And I think through fictions, and particularly symbolic heavy fiction, can help me kind of work them out. And I guess deep down, the hope is that by sharing them, by sharing my stories, in some way I can connect with somebody. You know, you spoke about how reading a book from the place you were from really affected you as a writer, to say like, oh, my experience is important. And I had a similar experience with writers, or with reading, when I was young, not necessarily in the specific place I come from, but just reading stories particularly about children who were experiencing similar things to what I was experiencing. I remember books, even Charles Dickens writing about orphans in England, or there's a book called My Friend Flicka about a kid who grows up on a ranch in Wyoming. And another book comes to mind that I read a lot when I was a kid, which was My Side of the Mountain. It's about a kid who
Uh-huh.
gets tired of living in the city and being surrounded by people, so he goes out into the woods. And just recognizing that other people are experiencing something similar to what I experience on the inside, as well as maybe on the outside.
Mm.
I think that's what I want to do for people. And so I just want to write stories that kind of allow that to bubble up. Currently, I'm working on finishing up like a manuscript for a book that I think I'm getting pretty close to having it ready to share with somebody. But it's kind of I would say it's the Egyptian myth of Isis and Osiris.
Okay.
And it's
I
just
was going to ask you if you were retelling like
yeah,
myths. Yeah.
yeah,
Uh-huh.
yeah. So retelling of myths, but masked in a way that you don't, the average reader is not even going to recognize,
Right.
because
It's
I'm
kind of
not.
almost just like a framework,
That's
almost.
right.
Like,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah, yeah. So that's what I'm working on right now. It's that kind of that Isis Osiris myth of Isis putting Osiris back together so that they can bring forth Horus. But it's kind of masked in a Western United States kind of end of the 19th century, mountain man cowboys. And it's got a lot of, because in my background, I was raised LDS or Mormon. So it's got a lot of kind of Mormon pioneer stuff woven into it as well.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Sounds
Yeah.
great.
Well, I hope like, yeah, I don't know that for me, and maybe you share this same feeling. For me, I don't want to just get published. Obviously, I do want to get published, but I don't want to hurry to it. I want to produce something that's really high quality. I want it to be right, not just done, but I want it to be right. And so that's that obsessiveness in me, is that I'll spend a lot of time just going over it and over it and over it and just trying to make sure that every little kind of offhanded statement that I make is actually the one that needs to be there, rather than just the one that first popped into my mind. And I just hope, as a writer, I really do hope to be as good as I can be. I just want to achieve something there.
I think there's something important, isn't there, as well, as if you do, publishing isn't an end in itself anyway, and that's certainly something that I've learned over the last 2 years, in particular since I did start publishing seriously, is that it's almost only the beginning, or it's not even half the journey. Once you publish, you then need to take it out into the world and kind of share it with people and kind of enter into conversation. But I think there's something really honourable and important about the discipline of getting something right and being really happy with it before it goes out for publication, because you are inviting your reader into a contract to share their time and their energy and their heart with you, their feelings. We talked about feelings earlier, to share those and be vulnerable with you on the page. And so they need to be kind of adequately rewarded, I think, for that. Not to make it sound too transactional, but I just think that there is a kind of important not monetary exchange, but exchange between people that has high value. And so therefore it is really important to get things right. I mean, apart from the fact things won't get published if they're not right anyway, because I think others can see it, editors can see it a mile off.
Yeah. Well, I think you're right. The contract there being that somebody's going to spend days, weeks, or even months with your book, and they need to be rewarded. And a lot of time that reward is kind of an emotional response inside of themselves, that something says, "Oh yeah, this makes sense to me. Yes, I agree with this," or and that's how I've experienced books. When I read a book, you go through it, and every now and then they say something in just the right way, or they present an idea to you that it's been on the surface for you, but hasn't fully arisen. And the reward there for me as a reader is, it's astounding. It's amazing. You spoke earlier about, with poetry, being able to fit it into your life because you can write a poet while the kettle is warming. But what about consistency, structure, discipline? How do you kind of, just getting really pragmatic about writing, how do you approach that?
Well, now, so when my kids were babies, I got quite good at writing late at night because my kids were always sleepers. That was the one thing I felt really lucky with the kids, was that they would go to bed, like once they turned into toddlers, they would go to bed at 7 o'clock in the evening, 7:30, and they would sleep all night. So I kind of knew I had that time. I mean, I was tired, but I had a couple of hours, say, when I could get some writing in at that point in the night. So I did that for a while. And then the thing that was a real turning point for me was I was really lucky to apply for and get an Arts Council grant. So that's our kind of institutional body in the UK that provides the majority of arts funding to developing artists. It was called a Developing Your Creative Practice grant. And it kind of funded me for about a year to be mentored by a really great poet called Pascal Petit, and to provide some research time, so funds to go off and look at some particular archives. And it also paid for me to write a certain number of days a month. And so I turned I was juggling a kind of freelance career and children that weren't yet in school, I think, but were in a nursery situation. So I was like, okay, I'm just going to have to pick a day and say that's my writing day. And I just chose Monday. I was like, coming out of the weekend, almost in that dream state. You know, if you haven't had to work over the week and you sort of stumble out into the week and you are still in a kind of dream state, like, that is a good state to start writing in, to say that's my dedicated writing day. So I started doing that probably about 5 or 6 years ago. And Monday is to this day my sacred writing day. So I have that discipline that no matter what else is going on, I write or research or do something, go off on a trip, go somewhere I need to go, and to look at an archive or to go to a place that I'm writing about every Monday. So that's like the sort of the kind of key point in the week, I guess. But then also, yeah, discipline and deadlines, self-imposed deadlines. I've spent the last 2 months really preparing a book proposal for a non-fiction book. And there was nobody hanging over me telling me that I had to get it done. There's nobody cracking any whips. But I just thought, I know I've got a kind of period now where I can get this done. And if I leave it, it's just going to drift forever. So I just kind of gave myself that deadline to get it done. And luckily, it's worked out. I kind of finished the proposal. I worked really, really hard on it, and I sent it off to an agent. So in the UK, non-fiction is sold on proposal. So you don't write the whole book. You just get it. You get a contract based on the proposal. So I've been doing that, and it's done. And I think that kind of obsessive kind of determination, but also passion. I mean, is a nicer way of putting it, perhaps, than obsession. A sort of passion and deep interest in storytelling. In communication has really driven that. So I think about writing all the time. I run a writer development organization called Dialect, which is for writers who are based in rural and kind of, we call them edgeland sort of places around the UK and beyond. Actually, we've had people come to us from Canada and Germany and France and Australia. And I kind of do that to sort of serve people who are underserved, right? Who don't live in big cities, but they've got access to great development opportunities and so on. So I'm thinking about writers and what writers need and what writing can do and achieve and so on, like every day, and then I try to write as much as I can every day, or as much as I can every week, let's say. And I normally have like 1 or 2 projects sort of going on at the same time. So that if one is stalling a bit, I can kind of pick up the other. But what I'm finding really interesting is at the moment, I can barely visualize myself ever writing a poem ever again at the moment, because I'm in a completely prose headspace. And I'm sure I'll come back round to poetry again soon at some point when I'm ready. But at the moment, I'm fully a prose focused person. And that does take more time and more, like just physically just takes more time at the keyboard. Getting things down on the page, but I relish it. I enjoy it so much.
Yeah, beautiful. I feel very similar. So that drive inside of me, that passion, whatever it is, for me, if I don't write consistently, I start to feel kind of cranky. I start to feel not myself, and like this summer, for example, we've had a lot of people come and visit, and so it kind of disrupts things. And there's just part of me that's chomping at the bit to get back to it, because it just makes me feel like sane. It makes me feel as if I'm making progress. And I think progress is the best motivator when you can actually see something appearing. But
I love that feeling of chomping at the bit. By the way, can I say, I think it's a good feeling to want to get back to it and to not be avoiding it is great.
Yeah. And once you do get back to it, it's a huge relief. But it sounds to me like, obviously you followed your passion, but also going back to this kind of ego, unconscious language. People like you who are able to set times, stick to that, find moments, and just really try to work at it as much as they can. To me, it seems like a very healthy or strong ego. And I think a lot of times people talk about ego as if it's a bad thing. But a healthy ego or a strong ego I see as something that is disciplined, right? So the ego that is strong is able to say, this is what the ego is, the thing that outlines the time and space, and
Okay.
then
Yeah.
forces you to actually sit down and do it. And so you need a strong ego to be able to do that. But then once you're there, you also need a strong ego to be able to get out of the way and allow the creative, the creative juices to flow and the unconscious to take over. And I think a lot of people who struggle with writer's block or who postpone things, and this was me for a long time because I had this sense that I didn't know what to write, or I didn't know how to write. At some point, you just gotta your ego's got to mature a little bit, and you've got to let it put you in the place and then get out of the way and let the creative process happen.
So I think I know how I do that. It's really interesting listening to you talk about the ego. It's the kind of language that I don't use really, but I can completely grasp what you're trying to say. And I think firstly, the ego is a muscle that is developed over time. And I think it's partly developed by I'm completely self-employed, and I have been almost my entire life, apart from a few proper jobs here and there. And so I've developed that kind of consistency and self-organization over years. And it's also driven by having quite a lot of grief in my life, right? So recognizing that time is really finite, and it's really, really important to do the things that you think you're here to do, and that motivate you and that drive you. And by doing that, you're a better person to those around you as well. You bring joy to the people that you have relationships with, your family and your friends and beyond. So that's the kind of, I think, the ego, it needs exercising, like, on a really seriously to kind of get it into shape so it gets you to the page. My favorite place to write is in bed. I call it my boffice. And I think one of the reasons why it's my favorite place to write is partly because that was where I wrote when the kids were little. So when they were babies, I could write in the bedroom. So I was close to them, so I could hear them if they needed me to go to them. But also there's a vulnerability in that space, right? That by writing in that space, somehow you allow yourself, your ego goes wherever it goes. You tell me where it goes. I don't know where it goes. And there's a honesty. I find there's an honesty that comes out in the thinking and then subsequently the writing in that space. And I find it quite hard to write anywhere else. To do the real creative writing, I find it hard to write anywhere else. I can do research at a desk or in a library or in an archive, but when it comes to the actual writing, especially poetry, it kind of has to be in bed.
Yeah. The emotion finds the thought, and then the thought finds the words. It's probably good to be in a place where you feel very comfortable to explore those vulnerabilities, those emotions. Well, Juliet, this has been a beautiful conversation, and I've really appreciated your time. If people are looking to find your work, what you're working on now, or the books that you've published in the past, the Red-Handed, your book of poetry, where would people go to find you?
The best place to go to find me and then follow the trails is just my website, which is jlmmorton.com. jlmmorton.com.
Okay, awesome. And then we will keep an eye out for your nonfiction book that should be coming out in the future.
Yeah, I hope so. It's out with publishers at the moment, so it's on submission. So hopefully someone somewhere will pick it up.
Okay, yeah, awesome.
It's called Tenderfoot.
Tenderfoot. Okay. Well, when it's ready, I would love to have you back to talk about it.
Great. Thanks, Josh.
Yeah. Thank you so much.